My name is Diana. I am 28 years old, and my birthday party was in full swing when my father decided to make his final move. Here's your gift. The keys to a brand new Tesla. You deserve it. My dad announced loudly enough for the entire VIP room to hear, handing my twin sister her present. The room erupted in applause. Relatives who had ignored me all night suddenly turned their attention my way, waiting for the punchline they knew was coming. He turned to me, reaching into his expensive suit jacket with a theatrical smirk. But instead of keys, he pulled out a crumpled $1 bill and dropped it on the table right in front of me. "And this is what you deserve," he said, his voice dripping with mock pity. "Don't spend it all in one place." The laughter started at his table and spread like wildfire. My uncle slapped his knee. My cousin nearly choked on her drink. Even my mother pressed her napkin to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. My twin just stood there twirling her new Tesla keys with a smug grin. They all thought it was the ultimate humiliation. But I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. Instead, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. The timing was so flawless it almost felt scripted. I pulled it out, glanced at the glowing screen, and looked right back into my father's arrogant eyes. "Perfect timing," I said, keeping my voice dead level. His smile vanished instantly. The confusion settled in as I held up the screen. My mother's face went completely pale, the laughter dying in her throat. "Don't do this. Please," she whispered in an absolute panic, her eyes darting to the phone. But it was too late. They were about to realize that the daughter they had treated like absolute garbage for years was now the legal owner of their house, their assets, and every single thing they had built their fake, luxurious lives upon. Starting with that $1 bill. The crumpled $1 bill sitting on the pristine tablecloth was exactly how my father Edward had operated this family for over 2 decades. He used money as a weapon to purchase respect and crush anyone who dared to defy him. To him, financial control was the only metric of power. If you nodded at his lectures and stroked his ego, you were rewarded. If you showed a shred of independence, you became a cautionary tale. His method of parenting was nothing more than psychological conditioning. He turned every family gathering into a performance where he was the sole judge of our worth. I remembered Thanksgiving dinners where he would loudly interrupt my conversations to ask if I still shopped at thrift stores. During my college graduation, a degree I paid for myself, he stood up during a toast and offered to hire me as his secretary so I would not starve. He thrived on the audience. The relatives who laughed at the $1 bill tonight were the same people who had enabled his cruelty for years. They drank his wine, stayed in his ski cabins, and paid for it by participating in his public shaming rituals. He needed them to laugh, and he needed me to fail just to validate his own supremacy. Edward believed that without his funding, a person was fundamentally worthless. He meticulously tracked every cent he gave out, holding it over heads like a guillotine. He would bring up a car repair he paid for 5 years ago just to win an argument. The $1 bill he just threw at me was not a spontaneous joke. It was a calculated statement. It was the peak of dozens of times he had deliberately tried to strip away my dignity in front of an audience. He wanted to remind me that because I refused to play by his rules, I amounted to nothing in his world. My twin sister Jillian understood his game perfectly and chose to play it. She willingly embraced the role of his obedient golden child. She gave him exactly what he wanted, the illusion of a brilliant, successful daughter that he could brag about at the country club. She played the part of the visionary entrepreneur floating from one hollow startup to another. She launched tech apps that never went to market and opened boutique stores that closed within months. None of it mattered to Edward. As long as she allowed him to fund her lifestyle and control her decisions, he continued to write the checks. He bought her the Tesla today, not because her business succeeded, but because she remained entirely dependent on him. She was a financial black hole, and he was the proud sponsor of her incompetence. I chose a different path. I left that house at 18 with a duffel bag and a few $100s from a summer job. I refused to let my future be dictated by his conditional checkbook. While Jillian was attending networking galas on his dime, I was waiting tables to pay for my business degree. I took the extra shifts I slept in cheap apartments, and I completely cut myself off from his financial leverage. I stopped asking for help, which infuriated him. Since he could not control me with money, he tried to control me through humiliation. What Edward and the rest of the laughing relatives in this room did not know was what I had actually built during those years of silence. They still pictured me as the struggling waitress who could barely afford rent. They had no idea that I now lived on the East Coast working as an investment director for a major credit fund. My daily routine involved analyzing corporate risk, restructuring assets, and liquidating the portfolios of bankrupt individuals who lived far beyond their means. I managed hundreds of millions of dollars. I understood the mechanics of debt leverage and foreclosure better than anyone sitting at that banquet table. He thought tossing a $1 bill at me was the ultimate display of dominance. He believed he was standing on an untouchable pedestal of wealth. He had no concept of the reality that existed outside his manufactured bubble. The arrogance Edward displayed at Aspen was nothing more than a facade, and I had discovered the cracks in his foundation through public credit records. While he played the role of a wealthy patriarch, his financial reality was nearing a collapse. I had hired a firm of forensic accountants and legal researchers to monitor his holdings as soon as I realized his obsession with outward appearances was becoming unsustainable. They were not looking for private bank data. They were tracking public filings, tax liens, and asset records that were accessible to anyone who knew how to navigate the system. The findings were revealing. Edward had long ago burned through his liquid capital. To maintain the illusion of success, he had tapped into a home equity line of credit, a HELOC secured against the ancestral house. The record showed a total draw of $457,000. This was not a calculated investment. It was an emergency valve he kept opening to keep his life afloat. The funds were not restricted to a single purchase. They were being bled out to pay down maxed-out credit cards, cover the exorbitant membership fees at his elite social clubs, and mask the mounting losses from Jillian's failed business ventures. The Tesla was merely the final straw that broke the bank's patience. The loan had hit a critical default status. When a borrower fails to meet the repayment schedule, the financial institution holding the note typically marks it as a non-performing asset. Instead of initiating the long and expensive process of foreclosure themselves, many banks choose to offload these distressed debts to specialized debt buyers to clear their books. This was where my intervention occurred. I did not need inside information to know this was happening. I simply had to be ready when the bank listed the debt for auction. I utilized an LLC I had established specifically for asset management to place a bid on the note. Because I understood the valuation of distressed paper better than the casual investors who usually chased these auctions, my firm secured the debt at a significant discount. Once the transaction closed, the bank executed an assignment of mortgage. This document was the legal cornerstone of my maneuver. It formally transferred the rights of the mortgagee from the bank to my LLC. In the eyes of the law, I was no longer just a family member he could mock. I was the secured creditor who held the legal power to enforce the terms of his loan. Edward remained entirely oblivious to this shift in ownership. He operated under the assumption that his debt was a private matter between him and his original lender. He did not realize that the entity now holding his promissory note was an organization under my total control. The law did not care about the history of our family or his attempts to demean me. The contract was clear. The default provisions were enforceable. My lawyers ensured that every filing was recorded with the county clerk, making my position as the primary lien holder a matter of public record. I spent the weeks leading up to the trip to Aspen reviewing the amortization schedule and the specific covenants of his agreement. I knew exactly when the grace period expired and what legal remedies were available to me under the state's property code. I was not acting out of a desire for petty revenge. I was acting as a fiduciary of my own capital, enforcing a contract that he had proven he could not fulfill. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. He still believed he was the one holding the keys, while in reality I held the document that could legally authorize the eviction of his entire family. He had spent years telling me that I would never amount to anything, yet he had unknowingly placed his entire future into my hands. The acquisition of the debt that secured the ancestral house should have been a cold surgical financial victory, but the entire landscape of my motivation shifted the moment I met Chase in a quiet, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of Denver. Chase had been the closest friend to my late brother Dylan. For 7 long years, the family narrative had been consistent. Dylan had succumbed to a sudden, inexplicable depression that culminated in a tragic departure from this world when he was only 20. They used that tragedy to gain sympathy, turning themselves into the grieving parents who had lost a son to the invisible hand of mental illness. Chase placed a worn wooden box on the table between us. He had kept it for years, waiting for someone in the family who was not blinded by the curated lies of Edward and Margaret. I opened the box to find a stack of handwritten letters and printouts of emails. As I began to read, the weight of the truth threatened to crush the breath from my lungs. The letters detailed a systematic destruction of a young man's spirit. Edward had not been a grieving father. He had been a tormentor. The emails revealed that Dylan had earned a full academic scholarship to a prestigious university, but he needed a small stipend to cover initial expenses. He had turned to Edward for the funds, only to be met with a barrage of vitriol. Edward had mocked him for needing help, labeled him a weak-willed burden, and ultimately denied him the support. But the cruelty went deeper. I discovered that Edward had taken the money Dylan had saved from his own part-time jobs funds, specifically earmarked for his education, and funneled every cent into a failing business venture that Jillian had proposed. He did not care about the future of his eldest son. He cared only about feeding the ego of the golden child. When Dylan tried to protest, he was subjected to constant verbal abuse. The correspondence showed Edward calling him a disappointment, a failure who would never amount to anything, and a drain on family resources. The father I knew had effectively cut Dylan off from his path, stripped him of his dignity, and left him with no escape. The financial instability that eventually led Edward to take out the massive loan against the house had started long before the failed apps or the luxury vehicles. It began with that initial heartless decision to steal Dylan's future, to subsidize Jillian's lack of talent. My hands trembled as I realized that the man who had tossed a dollar bill at me in Aspen was the same man who had pushed his own son into the darkness. The cycle of debt and incompetence was built upon the ruins of a human life. I looked at the dates on the emails and the frantic tone of Dylan's last entries, sensing the desperation he felt as he realized he was being erased. The tragedy was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by a man who valued his own pride above the lives of his children. The cold, calculated legal maneuver I had planned no longer felt sufficient. My mission was no longer merely to enforce a contract or to recover assets. I was now an agent of an overdue accounting. The man who had taken everything from Dylan, who had built a life on stolen resources and fabricated status, was about to face the consequences of his actions. I felt a sense of clarity that I had never known before. Every step I took toward the final confrontation was powered by the need to ensure that the truth of what Edward had done to his own blood would be laid bare. He had used money to control and destroy. Now, money would be the tool I used to dismantle his entire existence. The clinking of silverware in Aspen pulled me back to reality, where Edward was still glaring at me after my perfect timing remark. The silence in the VIP room had grown thick, heavy with the uncomfortable realization that the script had deviated from his control. The guests sat frozen at their tables, their forks hovering above expensive porcelain plates. I did not announce what was on my phone. I simply stared at the glowing screen. There was no lengthy email to read, no paragraph of legal jargon to decipher. My attorney had sent exactly one word. Recorded. That single word meant the county clerk had officially stamped the documents. The transfer of power was permanent. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. Moving with deliberate slowness, I picked up the crumpled $1 bill he had thrown at me. I smoothed out the creases with my thumb, folded the paper neatly in half, and tucked it into my blazer. Edward watched my hands, his jaw tightening as his anticipated moment of triumph evaporated. He expected a tantrum. He expected me to storm out in tears, fulfilling the role of the defeated outcast. Instead, I stepped forward and took the microphone from the stand resting near the center table. The feedback whined for a split second, causing a few relatives in the front row to flinch. $1. I spoke into the mic, my voice steady and echoing across the quiet room. It is fascinating how much weight we put on currency. We use it to measure success, to buy loyalty, and in some cases to create illusions. I walked a few paces to my left, maintaining eye contact with him. You speak a lot about wealth, Edward. You lecture everyone here about financial supremacy, but I have a genuine question regarding your actual cash flow. I paused, letting the absolute silence stretch across the banquet hall. Why would a self-proclaimed titan of industry, a man who just handed over keys to a luxury vehicle, possess a severely delinquent junk status mortgage record? Murmurs erupted among the tables. A couple of uncles exchanged confused glances. Jillian stopped twirling her keys, her smug expression faltering. What are you talking about? Edward snapped, taking a threatening step toward me. His face flushed a deep, angry red. Put the microphone down right now. You are making a fool of yourself. Am I? I asked calmly, refusing to retreat. Because true financial titans usually do not have public default notices filed against their primary residences. They usually do not frantically borrow against the equity of their ancestral homes just to pay off overdue country club tabs or to plug the massive bleeding holes left by their favorite child's failed business startups. The murmurs grew louder, turning into audible gasps as the guests began to process the magnitude of the accusation. Edward's posture shifted from arrogant superiority to volatile, unhinged aggression. He pointed a trembling finger at me. That is enough, he shouted, abandoning his refined persona entirely. I will not have a failure stand in my event and spout baseless lies. Security. I want her removed from this premises immediately. He gestured wildly toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall, scanning the room for staff. He was losing his grip, reverting to brute force when his financial intimidation tactics failed to work. The sophisticated patriarch had disappeared, replaced by a desperate man cornered by his own secrets. Margaret stood right beside him. She did not yell. She did not join his outrage or attempt to command the room. She was staring at my posture, reading the absolute certainty in my eyes. She knew I would never step onto a stage and make a public, verifiable accusation without possessing undeniable proof. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking ashen and hollow. Her hands shook as the reality of my words connected with the past, due notices she had likely seen hidden in his office. She reached out, grabbing the fabric of Edward's suit sleeve. "Edward, stop!" Margaret whispered, her voice shaking with pure terror. She pulled on his arm desperately, trying to rein him in. "Don't do that. Please." Edward had just raised his hand to flag down security when I threw a stack of thick documents stamped in bright red ink dead center onto the banquet table. The heavy binder slapped against the polished glass, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. The liquid spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, but nobody moved to clean it up. Every eye in the VIP room snapped to the scattered papers. I did not waste my breath repeating the loan amounts or explaining the mechanics of his financial ruin. The time for warnings had passed. I simply pushed the pages forward, fanning them out so the bold legal headers were visible to anyone standing nearby. The top sheet was the official assignment of mortgage, bearing the undeniable raised seal of the county court. Right beneath it lay the recorded lien transfer establishing the new secured creditor. Finally, the notice of default sat at the edge of the table, outlining the immediate legal consequences of his unpaid obligations. Edward lowered his arm, the threat of calling security completely forgotten. His eyes darted to the red stamps, recognizing the unforgiving format of banking foreclosure notices. He leaned in, his bravado fracturing as he tried to comprehend how these private, catastrophic records had ended up at his celebration. He looked at the creditor name listed on the transfer deed, a corporate LLC he did not recognize. I reached out and tapped my index finger firmly against the printed name of that LLC. "I am the head of this company." I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "I personally executed the buyout of your distressed note when your lender decided you were no longer worth the financial risk. That brand new Tesla sitting in the valet lot is not a symbol of success. It is an asset purchased with toxic debt. And the ancestral house you are currently living in, the estate you use to host your country club friends, is now under my exclusive legal control. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The relatives who had been whispering moments ago fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer legal weight of my statement left no room for debate. I was not making a wild accusation. I was stating an enforceable, documented fact. Jillian stood frozen beside the podium. The smug, entitled grin that had been plastered across her face all evening was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, uncomprehending stare. She looked down at her hands. The heavy metallic Tesla keys slipped through her fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The sharp noise echoed in the quiet hall, but she made no effort to pick them up. The realization hit her in real time. She was not a business prodigy. She was the financial ruin of her own family. Her entire identity, built on a foundation of parental funding and fake startups, collapsed the moment those keys hit the ground. Margaret could no longer maintain her terrified whispers. The reality of the document severed her final thread of composure. She let go of Edward's sleeve, her knees buckling slightly before she slumped forward into her chair. She buried her face in her hands, resting her elbows heavily on the edge of the table, and began to sob uncontrollably. Her shoulders heaved with loud, ugly gasps. She wept as the pristine facade she had spent decades curating shattered into pieces right in front of the probing, judgmental eyes of dozens of relatives. There was no more hiding behind expensive suits or lavish parties. The ugly truth was sitting right there in black and white. The same aunts and uncles who had eagerly applauded Edward's generosity were now staring at him with undisguised scrutiny and disgust. They realized that the fine wine they were drinking and the extravagant venue they were standing in were paid for with empty promises and defaulted loans. The illusion of the untouchable patriarch was dead. Edward stood at the head of the table, completely paralyzed by the paperwork that proved his absolute insolvency. He opened his mouth to issue a denial, to spin a narrative about a banking error, but the physical evidence was too overwhelming. The county seals reflected the harsh lighting of the chandelier, offering zero room for manipulation. He could not buy his way out of this situation, and he could not intimidate the person holding his mortgage. When the truth of his insolvency was exposed, Edward frantically turned to the relatives, attempting to justify it as a simple cash flow issue, but I did not give him the chance. He raised his hands, stammering about temporary liquidity problems and short-term restructuring to mask the undeniable fact that he was completely broke. I watched him scramble to salvage his pride for a few seconds before I reached into my leather briefcase. The financial ruin I had just laid out on the table was merely the instrument of my execution. It was not the underlying motive. I needed everyone in that room to understand the exact reason why I had systematically engineered his downfall. I pulled out a stack of printed papers. These pages did not bear the seals of county courts or banks. They bore the timestamps of 7 years ago. I held them up, and the rustling of the paper cut through Edward's pathetic excuses. "This is not about a defaulted loan," I stated, my voice projecting across the silent hall. "The paperwork on that table is just the mechanism. The real debt you owe cannot be paid with money." I turned my attention away from Edward and addressed the crowd directly. "These are the final emails and letters written by my brother Dylan. For 7 years, this family has maintained the comfortable lie that his passing was a tragic, unavoidable consequence of sudden depression. You all accepted that story because it was polite. It absolved everyone of responsibility." I looked back at Edward, whose face had instantly drained of whatever color remained. The panic in his eyes was no longer about losing his house. It was about losing his mask. Dylan did not just give up. I continued reading the harsh words printed on the page. He was systematically pushed. When he earned his academic scholarship, he needed a minor stipend to secure his enrollment. Instead of supporting him, Edward emptied Dylan's dedicated college fund to finance one of Jillian's catastrophic business ventures. And when Dylan begged for his own money back, Edward responded with this. I read Edward's exact words aloud, citing the sentences where he called his own son a worthless burden. I read the lines where he explicitly stated that Dylan would never succeed and was not worth a single cent of family investment. The cruelty of the text echoed off the walls of the luxurious VIP room. I laid out the timeline, proving that Edward's financial control and psychological abuse directly stripped away Dylan's resources, dignity, and will to live. You drove a 20-year-old boy to his breaking point just to protect your ego and fund your golden child. I told him, dropping the emails onto the table next to the foreclosure notice. You stole his future, so I bought yours. The loss of your home, your assets, and your public standing today is the exact price of what you did to him. The reaction from the guests was immediate and visceral. The shock of the financial revelation morphed into pure, unadulterated horror. The relatives physically recoiled. An aunt in the front row covered her mouth, staring at Edward with raw disgust. My uncle, who had laughed the loudest at the $1 bill, stepped backward, putting distance between himself and the man he now saw as a monster. No one offered a word of defense. No one suggested a misunderstanding. The evidence was in his own written words. The exodus began in total silence. Guests picked up their coats and purses, heading for the heavy wooden doors without looking back. No one said goodbye. The grand birthday celebration dissolved into a rapid evacuation, leaving Edward standing completely isolated in the center of the room. As the hall emptied, Margaret scrambled around the table. She stumbled toward me, her face stained with ruined makeup. She grabbed my forearm, her fingers digging into my blazer. "Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of total destruction. "Please, I am so sorry. We can fix this. Forgive us. Have mercy." I looked down at her hands, then up at her desperate, tear-streaked face. I firmly grabbed her wrist, detached her fingers from my arm, and pushed her away. The blizzard in Aspen that night was only the beginning of an endless winter for Edward and Margaret. The American legal system does not operate on emotion, nor does it care about the social standing a family once held in their local country club. Over the following months, the meticulous, unforgiving machinery of the foreclosure process ground forward with absolute precision. The statutory grace periods expired without a single payment being made. The state-mandated redemption windows permanently closed. Every desperate extension they tried to file with the local courts was swiftly denied because they simply possessed no liquid capital to back their claims. Edward's attempts to leverage his old networking contacts failed miserably. No one in his elite circles wanted to lend a single cent to a man whose toxic financial history was now a matter of public court record. The facade was gone, and the isolation was absolute. When the final day of eviction arrived, I did not fly back to watch the execution of the writ of possession. I did not need to witness their physical removal. My attorneys provided a sterile clinical report of the morning's events. A county sheriff pulled up to the long driveway of the ancestral estate, an official cruiser parking right where the repossessed luxury vehicles used to sit. The armed officers knocked on the heavy oak doors, presenting the final court-ordered eviction notice. Edward and Margaret were escorted out of the property under the watchful eyes of the neighborhood they had once tried to dominate. There was no grand audience this time. There were no relatives to impress, no catering staff to command, and no golden child to shield them. Jillian had already abandoned them, fleeing the state the moment the funding dried up. Edward and Margaret carried their remaining personal belongings in cheap cardboard boxes, loading them silently into the back of a rented moving truck. The house was secured. The locks were immediately changed by the bank contractors, and the massive property was prepped for the upcoming liquidation auction. The empire built on debt and cruelty was officially dismantled brick by brick. That afternoon, sitting in my East Coast office, my cell phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID flashed Margaret's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, but less than a minute later, the screen lit up again. This time, I answered the call, letting the heavy silence stretch across the line. "Please." Margaret's voice broke, immediately sounding small, panicked, and entirely broken. "We are loading the truck right now. We have nowhere else to go. Let us set up a payment plan. Just a few $100s a month. We can work this out over time. Please do not take the house. It holds all our family memories." She was still trying to negotiate a deal, still hoping to pull a thread of familial obligation to save her comfort. Dylan needed a family once too. I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of anger or sympathy. And you let him die to protect a lie. You chose your memories. Now you get to live with them. Before she could form another word, I disconnected the call. I opened the contact settings on my phone, hit the block button, and permanently severed the final tie to my past. There would be no reconciliation, no holiday dinners, and no second chances. I set the phone down and reached into my blazer pocket. My fingers brushed against the crumpled $1 bill Edward had thrown at me during the birthday party in Aspen. I pulled it out, smoothing the wrinkled paper against the cold surface of my mahogany desk. It was supposed to represent my absolute worthlessness. It was meant to be the ultimate insult from a patriarch who firmly believed he owned the world and everyone in it. I stood up, walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder in the corner of my office, and fed the bill into the slot. The steel blades caught the paper, pulling it down with a sharp mechanical whir. In less than 2 seconds, the ultimate symbol of Edward's tyranny was reduced to unrecognizable strips of waste. The ledger was finally balanced. The destruction of their empire was not just a financial correction. It was the inevitable consequence of their own malice. They had spent decades assigning price tags to human lives, discarding those who did not fit their perfectly curated narrative. In the end, the exact financial system they used to oppress and control others became the unforgiving instrument of their absolute ruin. You must never let toxic people determine your value. True worth is built in the silence of your own resilience, and karma, when properly directed, rarely misses an address.